Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'll be joined later by Ash Sarkar. Coming up tonight, Donald Trump has urged a fast Gaza deal. There's some talk that he's potentially going a bit harder on Netanyahu than in the past. I'll speak to a former Israeli negotiator about whether or not that should be taken too seriously. Also, if you thought British politics was chaotic, look over at France. Their prime minister has resigned after less than a month. They've had 3 prime ministers since last year. Greta Thunberg has been deported from Israel. We'll give you an update on that story. And we're also going to talk about Shabana Mahmood having discussed banning regular protests because you're only allowed to protest a certain number of times, apparently. Also, Trump's goon squads are, they're often going viral on my Twitter. They tend to look quite unpleasant. I'm talking about ICE, of course. It turns out the UK right want to copy them. So this was an announcement at the Tory party conference. They want to bring about a UK ICE to deport 150,000 illegal migrants every year. I suppose the silver lining here is there's no way that they're getting back into power anytime soon, but worth talking about anyway because it's very similar to the plans of Reform, who are more likely to form a future government. Stay tuned for all of that and more. And if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. It's almost 2 years since Hamas's October the 7th attacks, and almost 2 years since Israel began its genocidal war against the people of Gaza. Now, in that time, we've heard about multiple plans for a ceasefire in Gaza. But on Friday night, there were signs this time could be different. So in a surprisingly blunt statement, Donald Trump said this: "Based on the statement just issued by Hamas, I believe they are ready for a lasting peace. Israel must immediately stop the bombing of Gaza so that we can get the hostages out safely and quickly. Right now, it's far too dangerous to do that. We are already in discussions on details to be worked out. This is not about Gaza alone. This is about long-sought peace in the Middle East." Now, an American president publicly calling for Israel to stop the bombing is unusual. And he was responding to a statement from Hamas with that group's response to a 20-point plan put forward by Trump last week to bring about peace in the Middle East, or so he says. That plan involved the immediate release of all Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian detainees. It required Hamas to decommission its weapons. Most controversially, it also required Gaza to be governed for a period by an international board chaired by Donald Trump and, of course, involving Tony Blair. The more difficult part of the 20-point plan for Netanyahu was that it stated that it would, quote, pave the way for Palestinian self-determination and statehood. So what was Hamas's response, and the response that Trump so enthusiastically welcomed on Friday night? Well, these are some of the key parts from their response to the 20-point plan. So Hamas said, "After thorough study, the movement has made its decision and conveyed the following response to the mediators. Hamas appreciates the Arab, Islamic, and international efforts, as well as the efforts of US President Donald Trump, calling for an end to the war on the Gaza Strip, the exchange of prisoners, the immediate entry of aid, the rejection of the occupation of the Strip, and the rejection of the displacement of our Palestinian people from it. Within this framework, and in a manner that achieves an end to the war and a full withdrawal from the Strip, the movement announces its approval of releasing all occupation prisoners, both living and remains, according to the exchange formula contained in President Trump's proposal, with the necessary field conditions for implementing the exchange. In this context, the movement affirms its readiness to immediately enter, through the mediators, into negotiations to discuss the deal. The movement also reaffirms its approval to hand over the administration of the Gaza Strip to a Palestinian body of independents, technocrats, based on Palestinian national consensus and supported by Arab and Islamic backing. As for the other issues included in President Trump's proposal concerning the future of the Gaza Strip and the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, this is tied to a collective national position and in accordance with relevant international laws and resolutions to be discussed within a comprehensive Palestinian national framework in which Hamas will be included and will contribute with full responsibility. So interestingly, Trump on Friday posted the statement in its entirety, which included a first paragraph, which I didn't read to you there, which described Israel's actions as a genocide. So that seemed to be the US president recognizing what was really going on. He did go on to delete that post. The important fact remained, though, Trump considered this response from Hamas as enough to justify a ceasefire. That was a point he reiterated in a message from the Oval Office.
So I just want to let you know that this is a very special day, maybe unprecedented in many ways. It is unprecedented, but thank you all. And thank you all to those great countries that helped. We were given a tremendous amount of help. Everybody was unified in wanting this war to end and seeing peace in the Middle East. And we're very close to achieving that. Thank you all, and everybody will be treated fairly.
Now, according to Axios, Netanyahu wasn't quite so convinced by Hamas's response to the 20-point plan. So this is from Axios. When Hamas came back with a yes, but to President Trump's Gaza peace proposal on Friday, Trump called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss what he saw as good news. Netanyahu felt differently. Quote, Bibi told Trump this is nothing to celebrate and that it doesn't mean anything, unquote. A US official with knowledge of the call told Axios. Trump fired back, I don't know why you're always so effing negative. This is a win. Take it. Now, over the weekend, Donald Trump continued to very publicly pressure Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire. So on Truth Social, he posted images of the protests in Israel by hostage families who have been calling for months for a ceasefire deal. They're holding a giant banner there saying it's now or never. Unusually, and this is really interesting, Trump also posted an article from the New York Times, the failed New York Times, or the New York Crimes. And the article he shared has the headline, How Fury Over Israel's Qatar Attack Pushed Netanyahu on Gaza. The Qatar attack in question was, of course, that on the 9th of September when Israel bombed the US ally in a failed bid to kill Hamas negotiators. And the New York Times report that the attack came as a surprise to American negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who felt their attempts at mediation had been undermined. The NYT write this. Some White House officials say saw the failed strike as an opportunity. Mr. Netanyahu had taken the shot, thinking it could make his already weak enemies even weaker. But Israel had missed its targets, and the strike had the opposite effect, infuriating the United States and influential Arab governments. Perhaps, the White House officials thought, the moment could be exploited to get Mr. Netanyahu to budge on some negotiating points he had long opposed. Now, this is an article based on sort of sources close to the White House, but Donald Trump, by publicly tweeting that story, is presumably publicly endorsing it. And in the run-up to negotiations in Cairo, which is taking place today and tomorrow, he seemed confident a final deal would be reached.
We don't need flexibility because everybody's pretty much agreed to it, but there'll always be some changes. But the Hamas plan, I tell you, it's amazing. You're going to have peace, if you think about it, peace in the Middle East for the first time in, they say, really, 3,000 years.
So the Hamas plan, I tell you, it's amazing. Again, not usually words you'd expect to hear from an American president. To discuss Trump's so-called peace plan, I'm joined by Middle East analyst and former Israeli negotiator Daniel Levy. Welcome back to the show. We've had you on numerous times to discuss many a ceasefire proposal over the past 2 years. None of them have come to much. Is this time any different?
It's the first time in 3,000 years that we've spoken with a modicum of, this is serious issues. Okay. What is different here is that the country enabling, the party enabling genocidal assault has put something on the table that it wants to hold both sides to. And with all the flaws and shortcomings, and they are monumental, certainly when it comes to any future arrangement, the question of this ceasefire, scaling up of humanitarian assistance, withdrawal of the IDF is in there, and now it all depends on the deal. Because what the plan doesn't have is those details. What it would need to have details that offer a credible pathway from a ceasefire, release of hostages, release of Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel, often in detention without trial, to at least an end to the grinding, horrific suffering in Gaza. I think beyond that, this is a plan that belongs in the dustbin. But if it can end the genocide, then we have something to work with. I'm not at all sure that's actually how it plays out.
And what do you make of the reporting about this in terms of sort of the diplomacy that led to this deal? Because obviously, this is a deal that was reached without any input from the Palestinians. But the reporting suggests that the Arab states maybe had more input into this sort of deal than previous ones. And that's because the United States was so annoyed about the attack on Qatar that they were willing to be more open to the Arab position as opposed to the Israeli one. Do you buy that?
So I want to be really cautious with this. The idea that Netanyahu is engaged in hubristic overreach and that by bombing the capital of Qatar, where America has its largest military base in the region, and sending the signal to the Gulf states whom Trump had visited, has those relations with. His sons and family all do rather nicely from those relations. Thank you very much. Netanyahu sent the signal, I don't give a damn about those relations. He sent the signal, American security guarantees are worthless. You saw within days, Saudi and Pakistan making an arrangement. You saw, or at least I heard, a lot of talk in the Gulf. How do we hedge? When were we Beijing? What are we doing there? You'd already seen Trump push Modi into the arms of Putin and Xi Jinping at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. So I do think that the hubristic overreach on the part of Netanyahu finally hit a place where it blew back in his face. I think other elements might do so in the coming years. There are some parts of that already. What that then set in motion, as you say, was a meeting that Trump held with 8 Arab and Muslim majority leaders in the margins of the UN General Assembly, which led to this paper. But then what we have to bear in mind is the paper that Trump presented, those 8 states came back with revisions. All those revisions were rejected. In fact, the paper was walked further in the direction of Israel. I think quite smartly, the mediating parties then said, well, look, we know more or less what might be possible with Hamas. They've been working in mediations between Israel and Hamas for 2 years now, so they have a clear sense of that. And they said to Hamas, give us something to work with. We'll make sure that Trump responds by seeing this as a yes and then we can try and get into the details. So that is what's happening right now in these proximity talks in Cairo, trying to ensure that there is credibility to the idea that the hostage release will lead to an Israeli military withdrawal, will lead to the massive scaling up of humanitarian assistance, will lead to the end of Israeli attacks. Netanyahu has told us he will stay in Gaza and he is likely to resume his military activities. That's what's being played out right now. I think that to a significant degree, most people are focusing on that and kind of parking all this stuff about the future colonial administration under Trump and Blair for Gaza. Remember, the West Bank isn't mentioned once in the 20 points whatsoever. The Arabs try to get reference, the Arab states and Muslim majority states try to get reference to the West Bank in. That was rejected. So I think if we stay on that narrow focus, that's what's going on.
The reason why all of the ceasefire plans before have failed is because, I mean, we've talked about this many times on the show, because what Hamas don't want is to release all the hostages, which are, they're human beings who are suffering, but on a strategic level, they're Hamas's only leverage. The only thing sort of, I suppose they think, stopping Israel from completely leveling Gaza, because they think that that's, something they have to limit what Israel do, because there are Israeli people who are also at risk when Israel is bombing the strip. So what they don't want to do is give up all of their leverage and then Israel just continue the war, but in an even more genocidal fashion, let's say, and even with even fewer limits than they currently have. Is there anything to stop that here? I mean, why would Hamas have the confidence to release all the hostages thinking that Israel won't just immediately go back to war?
I think one of the difficulties is that there are no ironclad guarantees. And so I think what Hamas, as one understands from all the leaks, from everything we've heard, from things that are public source, what Hamas has been doing is trying to create what I call maximum plausibility to the idea that this will be predicated on more than, hey, we're America, trust us, trust Israel, these are great guys, which is obviously not worth anything. So what they want to know, and I think this is what the mediating parties are trying to move with them, how realistic is it this time? Is he ready to sustain a standoff with the Israeli premier? They may also look at this, and I think this is what happened in January, okay, when there was a deal. There was no ironclad guarantee then. I think Hamas looked at it then and said, okay, we start the release. That's going to set in motion a dynamic. It's going to be harder for the Israelis to come back in. Now, that didn't prove to be the case. And so I think on the one hand, it makes it more difficult now. On the other hand, there is a sense that the hostages and as you say, I want to see those people out. I want to see an end to this. I want to see much more beyond that. But the hostages, if one looks at it as we were just doing, as a currency that can be traded, that Netanyahu has kind of won the argument in the Israeli public. Move on, the hostages are expendable. Those aren't the words he uses. Those are the sense that the hostage families get. So maybe it is worth rolling that dice. They also get something very tangible, which is Palestinian prisoners released straight away. And they get, and this is what, again, the mediating parties are trying to convince them, they get those parties who've demonstrated that they have a certain traction with this White House. They get them on side. Does any of that offer a real guarantee? I would say not. Will Netanyahu be telling his coalition allies, just stick with me, this war will continue. In the meantime, we'll do all kinds of mischievous, destructive, displacing Palestinian stuff in the West Bank. We've got a green light for that. And read my lips. We will be back killing Palestinians in Gaza before you know it. Just don't quit the government yet. So that's the tug of war. Unfortunately, we can probably guess where it ends. But what they will be told is that's not guaranteed. Give this a chance. How that plays out, we will see. What Hamas have said, and you mentioned this in your opening, is the part of this that is on us to negotiate are the terms for the prisoner exchanges, immediate entrance of humanitarian assistance, and ceasefire. The question of a resistance movement disarming itself, the question of Gaza governance, the question of the long-term arrangements for Palestinians, what will be the ultimate outcome? Those are not for one faction to decide. They have said we need the Palestinian national movement to convene. Of course, that national movement has largely fallen into disrepair, given the predilections of also those who are running Ramallah. But that's the position they've taken.
Someone in the comments has said Sabra and Shatila. Now, I mean, they haven't said any more, but I assume that's a reference to the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, where you had Lebanese phalangists with Israeli backing carrying out a massacre against women and children in a refugee camp. And what had preceded that was there was a demand of the PLO to disarm and leave Lebanon. Now, one of the demands that's been made by Donald Trump in this 20-point peace plan, he sort of tweeted a lot about it, is to say, look, Hamas, you can survive, but only if you leave and disarm. And I think there'll be many people sort of in world opinion, let's say, who think that, if all Hamas need to do to stop the genocide is to leave and disarm, shouldn't they do that? Wouldn't that be the moral thing to do? But then people will point to that situation where the same thing was demanded the PLO. I think the PLO were given a guarantee that we will protect Palestinian civilians in Lebanon if you leave. They left, and then that massacre took place. So I suppose, could you talk about specifically the demand of Hamas to disarm or leave Gaza?
Right. So this is one of the most relentless disinformation components of a relentless disinformation campaign. Netanyahu has repeatedly told the Israeli public, and he said it in English as well, not just in Hebrew, that there are 5 conditions for Israel to end this. 2 of those are the release of hostages and the disarmament. But the others include permanent Israeli security control in Gaza and a governance structure that leaves out anyone recognized by Palestinians as representative or at least in some way speaking for Palestinians. So this is not going to end just on the issue of disarmament. And Netanyahu has made that clear. And one of the questions, again, that needs to be thrashed out is, does it matter that Netanyahu came out and immediately contradicted the American president and the American president's plan? Are his feet going to be held to the fire for doing so? We're not really seeing that thus far. One of the big questions is, it's one thing an American president expressing frustration and throwing some expletives at the Israeli prime minister, but can he actually sustain the standoff where he uses American leverage? We haven't seen it thus far, not Biden, not Trump. There are a coterie of Israel whisperers around Trump. There's the lobby, there's the Christian evangelical dispensationalist Zionists, etc. So it's an awfully big leap of faith. What that question, though, got ringing in my mind, if I may, is, of course, what happened was that it was, as you said, it was another militia allowed to do this by Israel, which carried out the phalangists, which carried out the massacre in Sabra and Shatila. And one of the things we know is that Israel has been using clans, militias, some of them ex-ISIS, that it has been arming and supporting and training to do its dirty work in Gaza in some areas. And there's talk in the Israeli press that would be expanded. And the reference of your commenter might be that this kind of thing could happen. And I do think that one of the big dangers is what will happen next in Gaza. One of the things in the plan is a reference to an international stabilization force. But in the changes to the plan that were made, presumably at Israel's behest, that force is now more linked to the colonial administration mechanism with Blair and everyone that the Americans and the Israelis apparently want to see put on the ground.
We'll be coming back to some of these issues when we talk about the flotilla later on in the show. For now, let's turn to a very different story.
Our political parties are continuing to adopt a stance that suggested that they all had an absolute majority in the National Assembly. They seem to want to make compromises, but it seems like actually what happens is that they want the other parties to accept all of their programme. That's true of the centrist bloc, but also of the other parties.
Those were the exasperated words of France's shortest ever serving Prime Minister, as he resigned earlier today. Sébastien Lecornu, a centrist ally of Emmanuel Macron, was appointed to be Prime Minister by the French President last month. That was after the then Prime Minister, François Bayrou, lost a vote of confidence. Lecornu was already the third Prime Minister since snap elections in July last year left the country's legislative assembly divided between the hard left, the hard right, and centrists allied to Emmanuel Macron. There are now widespread calls for Macron to call another legislative election. All very complicated. So has France simply become ungovernable? I spoke earlier to journalist Olly Haynes and began by asking him to explain the events that led to Lecornu's surprise resignation.
Sébastien Lecornu was appointed as Prime Minister relatively recently as a result of the collapse of the Bayrou government. And the sort of promise of appointing a new Prime Minister is that you will have institutional stability, you'll be able to have a parliamentary majority. But Lecornu wasn't really able to deliver that. He announced his cabinet last night, and it was essentially the same cabinet that had just collapsed. Almost everyone was in the same positions, with the exception of the Minister of the Armed Forces, which is where Lecornu used to sit. He was replaced by Bruno Le Maire, who was Macron's former finance minister, so the finance minister that oversaw the ballooning of the debt and the deficit, which is kind of part of what has caused this long-running political crisis. So people were very, very unhappy with this. Macron, since 2024, or 2022 in fact, has relied on Les Républicains, which is kind of like the French equivalent of the Tory party, in order to have a kind of stable majority. And they had been hoping that they would get a lot bigger representation in the new cabinet. So when the cabinet was the kind of same sort of flotsam and jetsam of various Macron cabinets, they were very annoyed. They threatened to withdraw entirely from the government, which would have meant that the government collapsed from via external force. So Lecornu decided to resign this morning in order to prevent that from happening.
So the last Prime Minister, Bayrou, was overthrown in a vote of confidence. Presumably the parties that voted against him thought that a new government would look somewhat different and would include more of them. And it's essentially more of the same. I mean, the issue here is, isn't it, that the French Parliament, after Macron's snap elections last year, are made up basically of three blocs: the left, the right, and the centre. And there's not enough of them who can find some kind of compromise to govern France. Is France just completely ungovernable in this situation?
I think it is. There was a constitutional scholar on one of the main TV channels this morning, this guy Benjamin Morel, and he was saying that France hasn't seen anything like this since the kind of early days of the Fourth Republic. And he said that he couldn't see any kind of meaningful constitutional resolution to this crisis. In terms of, and I'm sort of inclined to agree with him, at least on the front that I don't see how new legislative elections would solve anything, because the left is trying slowly to kind of regather itself to run the alliance again. And if they're successful, then all of the polling suggests that a kind of similar three-block outcome would occur again. So if the left can get together, it's the same thing. The other alternative kind of way out of this crisis, which doesn't sort of undermine the accusation of ingovernability, but could maybe present a solution, is if Macron resigned. And that has always been a kind of distant possibility, but it is now one that is kind of growing in terms of the demand for it. And people on the right of French politics now, like the vice president of Les Républicains, are joining the chorus on the kind of radical left who have been calling for Macron to resign. And I think if we something to pay attention to is Mélenchon has put forward a motion of impeachment against Macron. And I think over the next sort of month or so, next few days even, the numbers of people willing to back an impeachment motion are going to grow, because basically there is no exit from the crisis under the current set of arrangements.
Just to clarify for our audience, sort of the constitutional arrangements in France, Macron can decide to call a new legislative election, which is what he did last year and what ended up with this free bloc situation, or he can call an early election for the presidency, which otherwise would sort of constitutionally have to happen by 2027, if I'm correct. What are the disagreements about? Is it a case of sort of personalities and no one really wants to get into a potentially unpopular government because, is it the case that everyone's thinking, I don't really want to sort of ally with Macron's people in Parliament now because that will be bad for me in presidential elections? So, is it that the sort of the Front National is saying, I don't want to help Macron survive because that will sort of count against us in 2027, and the left might be thinking the same, and these micro-centrist parties might have a similar idea, which is they want some independence from this unpopular party? Or is this sort of principled opposition to particular policies? I suppose, is this about people sort of trying to tactically position themselves for an election, or is this a fundamental disagreement about the way that France should be run?
I think it's both. So on the far right, they are playing kind of interesting game, particularly the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, where they have to simultaneously be seen as a force of disruption to the system, but also not too much disruption because they want to kind of make themselves seem palatable to the institutions, to businesses, and what have you. So they have sort of continually supported a Macron government and then collapsed it when either when they take sort of decisions that are too unpopular, basically. So the Rassemblement National is opposed to a certain amount of the austerity. They never have like a sort of fully worked out budget or anything, but they will say, no, that you're going too far with this amount of the austerity. We oppose it. We think the cuts can be found on immigration spending, like support for immigrants, or the cuts can be found elsewhere. So they're kind of taking a principled stance there, while also sort of seeking to like play a balancing act between not collapsing governments for the sake of it, but also not being seen to support the Macron coalition. It's a kind of, on the left, again, it's both. Everyone hates Macron and everyone is opposed to his austerity. So on the radical left, it's opposing him on everything. And then on the sort of softer left, it's, again, being seen to be responsible in the face of the institutions, but also trying to get concessions over things like the pension reform, over like the degree of the austerity. So yeah, it's kind of both. Everyone hates the budget and everyone hates Macron, and you kind of need to position yourself accordingly.
The obvious thing for Macron to do is to call new parliamentary elections, which, as you say, there's not really much reason to believe would sort of bring about a different outcome to this one. The other thing he could do is, I suppose, resign and call for new presidential elections. In a way, though, how would that help? Because presumably, again, you'd have another situation where you have a new president and then you have a parliament which is completely divided between the left, the right, and the centre. and some very unpopular policies, which whoever is in power is probably going to have to implement to some degree or another. I know the big issue is about sort of the debt and the budget. And there was an article in the Financial Times last week saying that actually French pensioners get paid better than working age people. I don't know if you saw that and what you make of it, but it does seem like if you've got a system where you've got weak government, divided government, fractured government inbuilt, and sort of political economic stalemate, let's say, it's just difficult to see where this goes. I don't know what, and I suppose that's why the markets are now also sort of saying, don't invest in France. But where do you see this going? How could this be resolved?
So I think, the gamble of certain factions is that a presidential election would throw up a different result, which is essentially what the radical left are saying. They think that they can maybe push Mélenchon over the line, and in the wake of a Mélenchon victory, a hypothetical Mélenchon victory, I don't think this is very likely at all. But what they would say is that in the wake of a Mélenchon victory, then there would be a further surge in the parliament. That's a kind of bit of a pipe dream, I think. The far right, again, sort of think that they could win either presidential or parliamentary elections. And again, that this would kind of remake the parliamentary arithmetic. So that's, again, another kind of gamble, but that's sort of what they're betting on. I think also there is an element of this which comes down to Macron himself and the fact that he is so wedded to like a specific program of reforms, particularly on pensions, particularly on like cutting the social state. And you could have a more centrist president that did command more support across the spectrum, that was not engaged in such a kind of shock and awe program of austerity, essentially, and like played the politics a bit less ruthlessly in a bit more kind of coalition building manner. So the figure of Macron does play into this because he really rejects any compromise. And he's been trying to kind of run the same Macronist governments pursuing the same exact set of policies for the last 2 years. Whereas if there was another centrist president or a president of the left or the right, you could potentially see different forms of coalition emerge, different kind of transactional agreements, etc.
From what I've read, it does seem like sort of the debt is one of the central issues here, and that's why Macron can't pass a budget. So I imagine sort of the left's pitch going into parliamentary or presidential elections would be, what we need to do is tax the rich more, and that means that we won't have to cut social spending. Macron is basically, we need to cut some social spending and become a slightly more neoliberal state. What's the far right sort of answer to that particular question? Is it just they say that it will cut immigration and that's suddenly going to save money, or do they have a more sophisticated answer than that?
Well, therefore, order in the streets and order in the public accounts. And they say that they're taking a kind of like Elon Musk, Doge kind of line, that there's a whole load of government waste and fraud, which if you cut out of the system, can be used to fund the social state in a kind of sustainable way. They're never very clear about their maths, but that's kind of their idea. There is like an element of like a certain degree of austerity with the far right, that they're not super in favor of like handouts or whatever, but they aim to sort of position themselves as more as better defenders of the social state than the Macronists. So there would be an element of cuts to stuff that the Macronists would also cut, but also these kind of hypothetical savings on waste, on fraud, on woke, whatever.
That was Olly Haynes speaking to me earlier today. I love the idea of sort of woke-based cuts. They just don't save that much. And on the topic of Doge-style cuts, there was a great piece in the Financial Times today on how they're not as simple as right-wing populists like to pretend. So after promising to cut costs, the new Reform Council in Kent is in fact set to raise council tax. So this is from the Financial Times. Kent was one of 10 English councils that Nigel Farage's right-wing populist party seized in a swathe of victories at local elections in May this year. He vowed to save a lot of money by abolishing wasteful spending. But Diane Morton, Reform's cabinet member for adult social care on Kent County Council, told the Financial Times that services in Kent were already down to bare bones. We've got more demand than ever before, and it's growing, she said, stressing she did not believe access to those services should be limited. We just want more money. Another cabinet member they spoke to suggested that Reform would probably raise council tax by 5%, which is the maximum you're allowed to. I'm joined now by Ash Sarkar. I suppose that interview, this resignation of this Prime Minister, this story in the Financial Times, I feel like politics in the West is just doomed to forever go around in circles where everyone hates the government. The right-wing populists say we're going to save loads of money by stopping immigration and cutting waste, and then that doesn't happen, and we're just going to go round and round in circles. Where do you stand on this?
Well, it's great for me because it means that I hardly have to do any prep for Novara Live, Michael. I can just go back, dig out my old notes from previous episodes, say the same shit, and then log off and eat my dinner. It's fantastic. I don't know really where to start. I think maybe I'll follow your order and I'll start by talking about France and then sort of move on to the parallels to the UK. I mean, as Olly said, the original sin here really for Macron is that snap election that he called to try and, I think, head off at the pass, the national rally, previously known as the Front National. And he thought that by driving a sort of binary choice between the far right and the centrists, there's a sort of similar move that he played to his benefit in the presidential elections. Maybe it can give him a parliamentary majority in the French National Assembly. I mean, obviously that didn't work out. And there is a sort of repetitive cyclical problem which keeps popping up, which is he installs a centrist MP. So, there was Bayrou, there was, of course, Lecornu, who just resigned after a single month. And what ends up happening is that they complain, well, no one else wanted to compromise. Now, I'm no fancy big city political strategist, but maybe one of the reasons why no one wants to compromise is because you have no leverage over them. And in fact, they have more leverage over you. Because if you're part of an opposition party who's also been blocked out at the behest of Emmanuel Macron, the refusal of the centrists to accept the left's choice of prime minister, way back when it was obvious that there couldn't be a stable government without some form of coalition building. If you refuse that compromise, and what you have is, essentially given them a big stick, is that opposition parties can go, all right, well, we can just keep on destabilizing the government. We can keep on destabilizing the government because ultimately Macron's choices are going to run out. And if he wants to avoid having to resign, he's going to have to do the other thing that he really doesn't want to do, which is call another snap election. And after, a year, 2 years of intensely dysfunctional parliamentary politics, we can be the beneficiaries of that. So Lecornu, that's why no one wanted to compromise. It's because you've kind of incentivized them not to. In terms of what you said about the adult social care budget, I mean, this is a story which is playing out pretty much in every single local authority, which is, the real, nest of bedbugs when it comes to the budget is in adult social care. And there are multiple reasons for that. Obviously, we have an aging population. We also have a less healthy population, particularly post-COVID. But there's a sort of long, a long chain of events that lead up to COVID as well. One is, of course, austerity. The cuts which impacted more deprived areas hardest also meant that there was then an increased need for social care services. And then there's also a second thing, which I think is really important to think about, which is the role of private equity in social care provision of all kinds. So we're not just talking about things like adult social care. We're not just talking about elderly care. We're also talking about the running of children's homes as well. So I think it's completely, it's morally sick and repugnant that children's social care and the running of homes for extremely vulnerable, extremely at-risk children is being run for shareholder profit, and that money comes from the state. I think that's utterly disgusting. But the role of private equity in various forms of social care is growing in this country, and that's part of the reason why council budgets are so unwieldy. So you had a sort of two-pronged problem, which was created by years of Conservative government, which is, on the one hand, you had the sort of shifting of a ton of responsibilities away from, NHS, away from central government responsibilities towards local authorities. And then those local authorities were like gutted of their money. And then on top of that, what you have is this increased role of private equity. So no wonder Reform are finding that the DEI budget doesn't nearly cover it, because, maybe it wasn't brown people and the immigrants' fault that things were so expensive. Maybe.
Greta Thunberg and 170 other activists from the Gaza aid flotilla have been released from detention in Israel and deported. Shortly before we came on air, Greta Thunberg landed at Athens airport and addressed a crowd of supporters.
They're not even able to prevent the worst war crimes from happening. And I will never, ever comprehend how humans can be so evil that you would deliberately starve millions of people living trapped under an illegal siege as a continuation of decades and decades of suffocating oppression, apartheid, and occupation.
Now, as you can see there, the crowd was really fired up after they quietened down a bit. Greta Thunberg continued.
What we aim to do with the global civil flotilla was to step up when our governments failed to do their legal obligation. Our governments are talking about ensuring human rights and the importance of getting humanitarian aid into Gaza, while failing to do their part and while failing to even the bare minimum ensuring safety for this mission.
There have been numerous reports of the flotilla activists suffering cruel treatment at the hands of Israel. Greta Thunberg and other detainees were reportedly deprived of food and water and subjected to other cruel treatment after Israeli forces illegally detained them in international waters. Journalist and activist Lorenzo D'Agostino was released in an earlier round of detainees being deported. He said this after landing in Turkey.
Greta Thunberg, a brave woman who is only 22 years old, she was humiliated and wrapped in an Israeli flag and exhibited like a trophy. I had the feeling of being in a really barbaric place, and I really hope that this barbarism might be over soon.
The Swedish Foreign Ministry sent an email to people close to Greta Thunberg after one of their officials visited her in detention. It said she informed us of dehydration. She has received insufficient amounts of both water and food. She also stated that she had developed rashes, which she suspects were caused by bedbugs. She spoke of harsh treatment and said she had been sitting for long periods on hard surfaces. Another detainee reportedly told another embassy that they had seen her being forced to hold flags while pictures were taken. She wondered whether images of her had been distributed. And the details of how Greta and other detainees were treated is obviously the subject of intense interest. But Greta herself and the activists she landed with said they didn't want that to divert attention from the much greater suffering that Israel is inflicting on people in Gaza.
I could talk for a very, very long time about our mistreatment and abuses in our imprisonment, trust me, but that is not the story. What happened here was that Israel, while continuing to worsen and escalate their genocide and mass destruction with genocidal intent, attempting to erase an entire population, an entire nation in front of our very eyes, they once again violated international law by preventing humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza while people are being starved.
Israel's foreign ministry has said 138 of the flotilla activists are still in detention. Among those who are now free is Novara Media's Kieran Andreou, who was welcomed home by a jubilant crowd at Heathrow. He gave an interview in Turkey during a layover on his way back to the UK.
Israel tried to put us in prisoner clothes, but we were not prisoners, we were captives, we were hostages. And that's what Israel does to Palestinians every single day. Palestinians like my own brother. And so it was so important for us to join the flotilla and take this stand. They put us in prisoner clothes. Turkey, you gave us real clothes. Thank you so much. For the world, Israel treated us terribly. It denied people essential medicine. One night, yesterday night, we were shouting that someone was possibly having a heart attack. They didn't come, they didn't care. They gave us food that was infested with insects. They subjected some people to torture. One of my friends has just passed out, fainted on the plane because of the exhaustion that they subjected her to. This is how Israel behaves towards Europeans. You can only imagine how it treats Palestinians every single day.
Now, obviously, a great relief to see Kieran back and well. We'll have him back on the show as soon as he's got some rest. Of course, while the flotilla activists described abusive treatment in Israel, closer to home, the Met has continued its mass arrests of peaceful activists opposing the prescription of Palestine action.
It's going to take hours to get all of these people arrested. They'll be here well into the night. And this is what the government thinks of as a good use of police time.
That was just a small part of a longer report from my colleague Stephen Meffin over the weekend, which you can check out on our YouTube. There were at least 449 arrests at that latest act of civil disobedience organised by the campaign group Defend Our Juries. These protests have been happening sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, regularly anyway, since the ban, which according to Shabana Mahmood means they may be causing something called cumulative disruption. And the Home Secretary told the BBC she plans to grant police new powers to crack down on protests that occur repeatedly in the same place.
I want to make explicit in the law that those types of protests with cumulative disruption for communities can attract the same conditions and restrictions that apply to other types of protests, so that the police have absolute clarity that they can use cumulative disruption as a reason for restricting those protests.
So she's saying this is a change that will be made sort of generally, changing what the police do consider when allowing or disallowing a protest. And of course, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the new powers are principally intended to target pro-Palestine activists.
And those protests in support of Gazans have been taking place regularly. They have been taking place often in the same sites in our city centres. So do you want to be candid about this and just say you are giving the police the power to ban those particular protests? That's the brass tacks of what you're saying.
So this is not about a ban, this is about restrictions and conditions.
It's unclear how the Met Police Federation chair, Paula Dodds, will feel about the announcement. She seems far from pleased by the strain the force is under as it's called upon to arrest hundreds of peaceful activists every week. She says there aren't enough of us. Hard-working police officers are continually having days off cancelled, working longer shifts and being moved from other areas to facilitate these protests. Our concentration should be on keeping people safe at a time when the country is on heightened alert from a terrorist attack. We are emotionally and physically exhausted. What are politicians and senior police officers going to do about it? An update for you. I see some people in the comments saying what's happened with Taig Hickey. He is in Athens today, so he has been released and is on his way. So he's in Athens, flying home tomorrow. David Adler, I think, was being held for a bit longer, but has been visited. I'll try and get the sort of a key update. As far as I understand it, everyone is, we don't really need to sort of significantly. So David, we think, is okay, not free, is what I'm told. So hopefully he'll be released shortly, and we'd love to get him back on the show to speak about his situation. The Tory party conference has a problem. No one gives a damn about it. The party is polling at 16%, and if there was an election tomorrow, they'd be completely wiped out. So how have they tried to garner headlines anyway? Well, they proposed a UK ICE. The party has pledged £1.6 billion towards their ICE-style removals force to deport 150,000 illegal migrants every year. And once they're detained, Kemi Badenoch doesn't care where they go.
They will go back to where they came from. That's what they need to do. We cannot have a situation where we can't deport people and say, well, we don't know where they go, so they can just stay here. That is basically inviting every single person across the world to our shores because we don't know where they would go afterwards.
So you think
this is a fatalistic and defeatist attitude, and I will not have that.
Now, the idea migrants will be sent out of the UK whether or not their home country is safe. And that's just a repeat of something Nigel Farage said earlier this summer. And the clamouring for a UK-style ICE is also an echo of Reform. So in August, after Reform announced their plans to deport 600,000 people, Zia Youssef bragged to The Times that Reform's plans will be like Trump 2.0. So what would it mean to be like Trump 2.0? And well, in terms of controlling borders, Trump has pretty much done what he said he'd do. He's ramped up the militarization of the southern border, and there are now record lows crossing into the US from Mexico. And there's a peak of 250,000 people a month crossing under Biden in December 2023. Less than 9,000 people were apprehended in April this year. Now, that change has been relatively popular, with 60% of Americans telling pollsters they approved of Trump's border policies in June. But Kemi Badenoch has specifically said the Tories want to copy Trump on ICE. So not on the border, but on ICE. Now, that has been a far more controversial policy. You'll remember the protests in LA in the summer over ICE raids at workplaces there. Well, that conflict has now moved to Chicago.
For weeks now, armed federal agents, some in full tactical gear, have been patrolling downtown Chicago, and new clashes have broken out mostly outside the suburban ICE facility, but also spilling into neighborhoods, hospitals, even outside schools. Operation Midway Blitz, as it's been called, has turned more aggressive, with ICE agents conducting overnight raids of apartments, leaving residents shaken in many cases. Each weekend, protesters have taken to the streets, and confrontations with ICE agents, some in masks, have become more intense, with the use of tear gas, pepper balls, and rubber bullets.
Now, the fact that ICE agents have their faces covered makes them look especially thuggish when they're just sort of apprehending, grabbing people in the street. I mean, this clip of ICE agents in downtown Chicago went viral this weekend. Now, if you're listening to that on the podcast, that was two ICE agents, one of them in uniform, one of them in plain clothes. Both of them had their faces covered, one with balaclavas, one with a scarf, and they were putting a man in a headlock in the middle of a busy road. And the man looked to be of Latino origin. And the man would go on to be de-arrested by passers-by.
Get the fuck out of here! Let me see your fucking face, bro! Let him go!
So again, if you're listening on the podcast, what you saw there was those two masked ICE thugs, essentially loads of people in the street sort of saying, what the hell are you doing? Coming or trying to come in between them and the man they were detaining, pulling down their scarves. And it was especially when one of the ICE agents lost his glasses that they seemed to freak out and decided that this wasn't for them. They got back in the car and drove off. So the man was free. And it leaves, I think, ICE agents looking terrifying and pathetic. And this was another viral video which made ICE look both terrifying and pathetic at the same time.
Get him! Watch out! Watch out!
Now, again, for those listening on the podcast, that was a bunch of militarized ICE agents in Chicago chasing a delivery driver who'd dropped his phone. He got away. Unlike the policies on the border, this thuggery is not a political winner for Trump, as was explained by this very animated pollster on CNN.
Look at ICE approval. All right, ICE's net popularity rating. You know, in Trump's first term, it was at 0 points. Not too great, but not too bad either. But take a look now. Look at this. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that agency, look at that. Minus 14 points. Down it goes because of their actions during the second Trump term. In fact, the Pew Research Center polled 16 different agencies. ICE's net popularity rating was 15th out of 16th. It was close to being the least popular of all. This bottom line is, John, the president may think this is a politically winning issue for him, but the numbers tell a very different story. It's, in fact, a political loser.
Ash. Obviously, the British right see lots of opportunities when it comes to migration, especially when it comes to the boats, for example. They think that's an issue that can get them back into power. Maybe not the Tories, but Reform certainly do. This move to try and copy ICE, though, is that, own goal, morally and politically?
Well, in terms of the British right, one of the things that they're going to have to reckon with is that the kind of masked thuggery that defines ICE operations in the second Trump administration is totally antithetical with at least the purported tradition of British policing. Now, obviously, if you expand out a bit from simply looking at bobbies on the beat, you look at some of the worst behaviour of the TSG, which is a particular public order of the Metropolitan Police, or indeed you look at the policing in Northern Ireland, you would see that this kind of benign image hasn't always stood up to scrutiny. But I think that's different from having a nationwide essentially, militarized police force across the country. I mean, part of the reason why, Northern Ireland, the policing was so violent and was so militarized was because there was something of a veil of silence drawn around it by, much of the media that was operating out of England. You can't do that if you've got your masked thugs terrorising Manchester, Birmingham, Bradford, Bristol, and parts of London as well. I mean, one of the things that I suppose I'd like to draw your attention to, because this is something that the likes of Reform and their sort of valorization of Doge and Elon Musk's early cost-cutting efforts, and for those listening to the podcast, I was doing scare quotes, is that the Trump administration has proposed an increase to ICE's budget that's tenfold, right? So 10 times more than its existing budget. There's $30 billion pumped into the recruitment drive alone, because what they want is to have 10,000 extra ICE officers recruited by the end of the year. The proposed ICE budget is $76 billion. I mean, these are vast sums of money. And the reason why they're spending so much money on it is because it is actually really quite difficult to recruit people to effectively terrorize the places where they live. So you've had to have all these inducements. So, benefits, healthcare, et cetera, but also things like, up to $50,000 as a sign-up bonus for new recruits. The ad spend for ICE is absolutely enormous, something like $5.7 million in television advertising, which is targeting America's metropolitan areas. So cities like Atlanta, Seattle, Boston, Chicago. Many of these are cities where, at least on the local municipal level, there have either been, city council motions or mayoral pledges to limit cooperation with ICE, and outside of when it's legally mandated. So you have to pour an awful lot of money into advertising for recruits, and you have to have inducements for signing them up. So it costs an awful lot of money. I think that's part of the Trump strategy, which is also, if you're gutting, federal jobs elsewhere, and you're gutting budgets for aspects of law enforcement elsewhere as well. City budgets are finding themselves cut. Then that's something which can be a bit of a push factor into these ICE jobs. But I think that's a question that Richard Tice, Nigel Farage, Zia Youssef, they're not likely to engage with it an awful lot. They'll probably just give the same rote answer of being like, "Oh, we're going to redirect money from DEI and translators." You're not going to find the money from DEI and translators for what is essentially a nationwide paramilitary force.
I think the Tories say they're going to pay for this by shutting the hotels. They're expensive, right? I think it's $6 billion a year, but the NHS is over $200 billion a year. So this idea that you can just cut on popular things and save money is like, most money goes on popular things, pensions, the NHS. So that's why I suppose, when I was asking you about France, I just feel like we're going to go round and round and round, where the centrists fail, the populist right get in, they say they're going to cut waste and it's going to be fine, and then they also mess up. Then maybe that does mean that it will swing round to the left and they can have a go. I was chatting to someone the other day who's sort of doing a left-wing social policy person, and they were saying, it feels like this is a bit out of vogue now because there aren't so many left-wing sort of parties that look like they're about to get into power in the UK, especially. And I was saying, no one's got a model that works, which means that people are going to be grabbing around for different ideas for a while now, I think. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.